Today, we're opening up something ancient, a set of regulations from thousands of years ago that feel remarkably detailed, almost like a very specific code governing health and cleanliness.
That's right. We're focusing on excerpts from the source text of Leviticus, specifically chapter 13. It lays out some truly granular rules concerning what are referred to as defiling skin diseases and also defiling molds.
So our mission in this deep dive isn't just to read the rules, but to, unpack them. Based purely on the text you shared, we want to understand the criteria used for identifying these conditions in both people and materials.
Right.
Explore the prescribed procedures and figure out what the outcomes tell us about this ancient system. Think of it as abstracting the core logic and maybe some surprising insights from this old rulebook.
And it's important to frame this, like you said, based only on the text. When it talks about defiling or unclean, we're looking at a system of ritual purity.
Yeah, separation from the community, sacred spaces. It's not necessarily our modern idea of, say, medical contagion, though there might be overlaps we can see.
Precisely. It's about ritual status within that specific framework.
Okay. Let's start with the regulations about these defiling skin diseases on people. The text immediately establishes a central figure. Who is the authority responsible for, diagnosing these conditions?
According to this text, the sole authority was Aaron the priest, or one of his sons, who was also a priest. They were the designated examiners.
The only ones who could make the call.
The only ones with the power to make that crucial pronouncement, clean or unclean.
So if someone had a suspicious spot on their skin, maybe a swelling, a rash, a shiny spot, they'd go to the priest. What were the initial, most critical signs the priest looked for? The things that would immediately flag it?
The text highlights two primary visual cues for immediate concern. First, if the hair within the sore had turned white.
White hair, okay.
And second, if the sore itself appeared to be deeper than the surrounding skin, like sunken in.
And if both of those signs were present right from the start?
If the priest's initial examination found both that white hair and it seemed more than skin deep, the text says he would pronounce the person ceremonially unclean right then and there.
No waiting period.
No waiting period needed if those key signs were present, according to the rules here.
Okay, that's the clear-cut initial case. But what if the signs weren't so definitive? Say it was a white, shiny spot, but it didn't look deep, and the hair hadn't turned white. This is where isolation comes in, right?
Exactly. If the priest saw a white, shiny spot that didn't appear more than skin deep and didn't have white hair, the text instructs him to isolate that person for 7 days.
A full week.
Yep. This suggests the system accounted for uncertainty. Isolation was kind of a diagnostic tool itself.
So they're isolated, then the priest checks again. What happens after that first week?
Well, the text gives a few possibilities. If the sore hasn't changed its appearance and it hasn't spread, the priest is told to isolate them for another 7 days.
Another week.
This double isolation really emphasizes the text's focus on monitoring changes over time for these uncertain cases.
Okay, so after the second 7 days, 2 weeks total.
After that total is 2 weeks, if the sore has faded and still hasn't spread, the text says the priest is to pronounce them clean.
Okay.
It clarifies that it was merely a rash. The person would then wash their clothes and be considered clean according to these rules.
But there's a catch, isn't there? Even after being pronounced clean from what seemed like just a rash, what if it does spread after they've gotten the all clear?
Right. The rules state they must go back to the priest. He examines them, and if the rash has indeed spread, they're pronounced unclean again.
Ah.
At that point, according to the text, it's confirmed as a defiling skin disease. The initial assessment was wrong, basically.
Got it. The text also talks about something called a chronic skin disease. Sounds more established. What are the criteria there, and is it handled differently?
It is handled differently. The text defines a chronic disease by specific signs. A white swelling in the skin where the hair has turned white and raw flesh is visible in the swelling.
Raw flesh, okay.
Crucially, the text says if these signs are present, the priest pronounces them unclean immediately, without isolation.
So no waiting period for that one.
Correct. This indicates a distinction in the text's logic. Uncertain or early cases needed observation via isolation, but clear chronic cases were considered immediately and definitively unclean.
Okay, now here's where we hit one of the most surprising rules in the text, at least for me. What does it say happens if the disease spreads all over the person's skin, covers them head to foot, and the whole area turns white?
This is indeed a striking detail. The text explicitly states that the priest should examine the person, and if the disease has covered their entire body, head to foot, and has all turned white,
Yes.
the priest shall pronounce them clean.
Clean. Covered in it, but clean.
Clean. The reasoning given is simply, since it has all turned white, they are clean. It's quite counterintuitive from our perspective.
So localized white hair and depth are unclean, but being entirely covered in white is clean. That's a fascinating contrast within the text's own system.
It is, and the text immediately follows this with an important caveat.
Ah, okay. What's the catch?
It states that if raw flesh reappears anywhere on that person who was entirely white and declared clean, they become unclean again.
So the raw flesh is the trigger.
The presence of raw flesh reverses that clean status.
And does the text mention what happens if that raw flesh then turns white? Does it cycle back?
Yes, it completes the cycle. If the raw flesh changes and turns white, the text says they must return to the priest. The priest examines them, and if the sores have indeed turned white, he pronounces them clean again.
Wow, okay. It's a dynamic status based purely on these visual signs. The text also details skin diseases coming from other things, like healed injuries, like after a boil or a burn.
Yes, and the procedure follows a similar pattern, emphasizing the same core criteria. If a white swelling, or maybe a reddish white spot, appears where a boil healed, the person goes to the priest.
Then the priest looks for
The familiar signs.
What?
If it seems more than skin deep and has white hair, it's pronounced a defiling disease originating from the boil, and the person is unclean.
And if those definitive signs aren't there, if it's, ambiguous.
If there's no white hair, it's not obviously deep, and it seems kind of faded, the priest isolates them for 7 days.
Standard week.
Right. If it spreads during that time, they are pronounced unclean.
Yep.
But if the spot remains unchanged and hasn't spread, the text calls it just a scar from the boil and pronounces them clean.
And the process after a burn, pretty much the same.
It's identical. Almost identical. If a reddish white or white spot appears on the healed raw flesh of a burn, priest examines it. Again, white hair and depth mean it's a defiling disease from the burn, unclean.
And if not?
If it lacks those signs, seems faded, isn't deep, then it's the 7-day isolation. Spreading means unclean. If it stays unchanged, hasn't spread, and is faded, it's deemed just a swelling or scar from the burn, and the person is clean.
The level of detail is just remarkable. It even distinguishes conditions on different body parts.
Yeah.
Are there specific rules if the sore is on the head or the chin?
Yes, the criteria shifts slightly for head and chin sores. The priest examines it,
Yeah.
and if it appears more than skin deep, the key sign is if the hair in it is yellow and thin.
Yellow and thin, not white.
Yellow and thin, specifically for the head or chin. If those two criteria, depth and yellow, thin hair, are met, it's pronounced a defiling skin disease on the head or chin. Unclean.
Okay, so white hair elsewhere, but yellow thin hair is the sign on the head or chin.
Got it. What if it's uncertain there?
If it doesn't appear deep and there isn't black hair in it, the text prescribes a 7-day isolation, similar to other uncertain cases.
And if after those 7 days it hasn't spread, still no yellow hair, and not deep, they must shave their head or chin except for the affected area.
Shave around it.
Exactly. And then be isolated for another 7 days.
Another double isolation period, just like the body rash.
Okay, what's the outcome after that second week for the head or chin?
On the 7th day of the second isolation, if the sore still hasn't spread and doesn't appear more than skin deep, the priest pronounces them clean. Wash clothes, you're clean.
And the same rule if it spreads after they're pronounced clean, like the rash.
Yep, the text states that if it spreads after the clean pronouncement, they are considered unclean. And the priest doesn't need to recheck for yellow hair then. The spread itself is the deciding factor.
Is there a sign the text mentions for the head or chin sore actually healing? A positive sign.
There is, actually. A specific indicator of healing is mentioned. If the sore remains unchanged, but black hair has grown within it.
Ah, the natural hair color returning. Exactly. The text considers the affected person healed and clean, and the priest pronounces them clean. The return of black hair is the sign of resolution there.
The text also quickly addresses other common skin things that aren't these defiling diseases, right? To avoid confusion.
Right. It clarifies that simple, dull white spots are just a harmless rash, and the person is clean.
Okay.
Similarly, a man who is bald, either on his head or forehead, is clean. Baldness itself isn't the issue.
But there's always a but.
But if a reddish white sore that looks like a defiling disease does appear on that bald head or forehead, the priest examines it. If it fits the description of one of these diseases, then the man is diseased and unclean.
So the default state, baldness, harmless spots, is clean, but the appearance of a suspicious sore, even there, triggers the whole examination system again.
Precisely.
We've gone through the identification, the diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
priest, criteria, isolation. What were the consequences, according to the text, if someone was actually pronounced unclean with a defiling skin disease? What happened to them?
The text lays out very clear and pretty strict social implications. Anyone pronounced unclean with such a disease was required to wear torn clothes.
Torn clothes.
Yes. Let their hair be unkempt, cover the lower part of their face,
Like a mask?
sort of covering the lower face, yeah,
Yeah.
and publicly declare their status by crying out, unclean, unclean,
They had to announce it themselves.
constantly. As long as the disease persisted, they remained unclean. And crucially, the text states they had to live alone,
Alone.
and live outside the camp.
Outside the community entirely. Wow. That level of required self-identification and isolation, it really underscores the boundary-setting nature of these rules in the community described by the text.
Absolutely does. Significant social separation.
Okay, the chapter then shifts gears, but stays under this umbrella of defilement. It moves to molds.
Yeah.
Totally different, but subject to similar
Yeah,
scrutiny.
exactly. Still dealing with defilement, but now on objects.
What kind of items were subject to these very specific mold rules?
The text applies these rules to any fabric or material spoiled with what it calls a defiling mold. This includes clothing made of wool or linen,
Okay, cotton fabrics.
woven or knitted materials of the same, and significantly, any leather or anything crafted from leather.
So not just clothes, but maybe bags, straps, other leather goods.
Potentially, yes. Anything made of those materials.
And what did this problematic mold look like? What was the visual cue here?
The text describes the appearance of the mold as being greenish or reddish.
Those specific colors.
The specific colors triggered the examination process, greenish or reddish.
So if you saw a greenish or reddish spot on your tunic or maybe your leather sandals, what was the first step according to the text?
Just like with skin diseases, the article had to be brought to the priest.
Back to the priest again.
Always the priest. He would examine the affected area and then isolate the article for 7 days.
Same isolation period. A week for potentially moldy clothes, too.
The same initial isolation period applies to objects as it does to people in these rules.
And after that week of isolation for the moldy item, what was the priest looking for? What determined its fate?
On the 7th day, the priest would re-examine it. If the mold had spread in the material, fabric, or leather, the article is pronounced unclean, and the instruction is absolute. That article must be burned.
Burned. Wow.
Spread is the key here for immediate condemnation after the first week. Total destruction by fire.
Okay, destruction for spreading mold. But what if it hadn't spread after that first week? Was there a chance to save it?
Yes. If it hadn't spread, the priest would order the article to be washed.
Just wash?
Washed and then isolated for another 7 days.
Ah, the double isolation again. Just like the uncertain skin cases.
Exactly. It echoes that process, showing a similar approach to verifying the status, giving it more time after an intervention.
Okay, so after washing and a second week of isolation, what did the priest look for then?
After the washing and second isolation, the priest examines it once more. The text gives a couple of possibilities here.
Oh.
First, if the mold hadn't changed its appearance, even though it hadn't spread further, it was still considered unclean and had to be burned.
Even if it didn't spread, if it just looked the same after washing, still burned.
Still burned. The text even emphasizes burning it regardless of which side was affected. So just the persistence of that greenish or reddish look, even without spread, could lead to destruction after washing.
What was the other outcome, if washing did seem to have an effect?
If the mold had faded after the washing, the priest was instructed to physically tear the spoiled part out of the fabric or leather.
Tear it out, like cut it out.
Tear out the affected section, yeah. This shows a method of partial salvage was possible if the condition seemed improved or lessened by the washing.
But even after tearing out the bad bit, there's another contingency, isn't there? Knowing this text.
You guessed it. It adds that if the mold reappears in the material after the spoiled part's been torn out, it's then considered a spreading mold, and whatever has the mold must be burned.
So recurrence means automatic burning.
The text is very strict about recurrence, leads directly back to burning the whole thing.
It certainly seems burning was a very common outcome for mold that was persistent, spreading, or came back. What about articles that actually made it through? The mold faded, was torn out, didn't reappear. Were they clean then?
Almost. The text gives one final instruction for any fabric or leather item that has been washed and is confirmed to be rid of the mold.
What's that?
It says it must be washed again,
A second washing.
a second washing. Only after that second washing will it be considered clean according to these rules.
So a double wash was the final step to ensure ritual cleanness for items that survive the whole mold process.
Exactly. The text wraps up this section by stating these are the precise regulations for pronouncing various materials, woolen, linen, woven, knitted, or leather clean or unclean based on the presence and behavior of these specific molds.
Stepping back from the specifics for a moment, it's really quite striking how these ancient laws, just as presented in this text, create such a complex, it's a visible sign-based regulatory system.
It really is.
It covers not only conditions on the human body with all these intricate rules for diagnosis, isolation, social consequences, all based purely on what you can see and how it changes.
Right. Appearance and change over time.
But it also applies a similar, really rigorous protocol examination, isolation, washing, potential destruction, based on the color and behavior of mold on, inanimate objects.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is the consistency you see in the underlying system described. The priest is the singular, designated authority for diagnosing this defilement in both realms, person and object.
The gatekeeper for clean and unclean.
Absolutely. And the text details this clear hierarchy of observable signs: color, depth, hair color or presence, spread, recurrence that determine the status. And that status leads to very significant consequences.
Yeah, from personal isolation and having to shout unclean to literally burning your belongings.
Exactly. It's a system driven entirely by visible phenomena, interpreted through these very specific set rules laid out right here in the text.
So thinking about this just based on the text we've looked at, what does its internal logic declaring something unclean based on, say, yellow hair or spreading mold, but then contrasting that with the rule that being entirely covered in white is somehow clean? What does that, combined with the really strict social separation required for the unclean, tell us about how this ancient society, as reflected purely in these specific verses, understood the relationship between what they could see, these physical signs, and their concepts of ritual purity, community boundaries, and maybe the role of that priestly authority? It's a lot to think about. That level of specific codified regulation for what seem like natural phenomena gives us a real window, maybe, into their worldview.